Yeah, Rick, it's such a pleasure and an honor to meet you and to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks, Jordan. It's my pleasure.
I think I speak for a lot of my audience when I say, as far as, the brand that I've created is called Spirit Science, but out of everybody on the planet who is a true spirit scientist, I don't know anyone better than you to really be first in line to receive that title. And your work truly is quite remarkable. It's inspired so many. And I think where I wanted to start was actually asking you about your new book and this work that you've done specifically, because when we first we had our touch base meeting a few weeks ago, and I praised you for your work, and you responded that you were just in the right place at the right time. And I was wondering too, because then in your new book, in DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, you talked about how there's this difference between mission and practice of what facilitates someone being chosen for prophecy. And it almost seems as though that your work, in a way, was prophetic, this pioneering the psychedelic research. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, it would depend on what you mean by prophetic. You're using it in the commonly accepted sense of the word in terms of foretelling or predicting. And in my prophetic states book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, I broadened the definition to include any spiritual experience as laid down in the Hebrew Bible. But in terms of my work being foretelling, I guess I suppose more a more accurate expression would be that it was ahead of its time. The DMT work occurred in the early 90s, and it took a long time for anybody to catch up. The Hebrew Bible work, it was also a no-brainer in a way, kind of like the DMT work was. It was, the obvious place to look to in order to answer certain questions.
It seemed like it did, didn't it? And I found it so interesting that even in the first book, in DMT, the Spirit Molecule, you described the story of talking with one of your colleagues, and you just asked him, you're like, do you think that, like, the pineal gland has anything to do with spiritual or mystical states? And he responded with this, like, there is no connection between, like, just a very hard line here. That must have been really difficult for you to be dealing with, like, while you're doing this pioneering research, all these other academics are basically telling you, no, there's nothing there, right?
Well, that comment about the pineal was, that occurred in 1983, I think. And I was still in training. I was doing my fellowship at UC San Diego. And I was just learning about, psychopharmacology at the nuts and bolts level, really getting into it, brain chemistry, brain pharmacology, subjective experience, giving drugs, giving rating scales, drawing blood samples and the like. And I was, pretty excited. And it seemed to me a stepping stone to really doing the work that I really wanted to, which was looking at the spirit, the biology of spiritual experience. So I was kind of just brainstorming with this professor. I hadn't really begun. I hadn't even started applying for any of my permits, but I was just curious. Kind of like, okay, we're at an institution where these things are happening. Can we, discuss this? And he just said, forget it. And it was a good lesson because I didn't have anything to lose because I wasn't really engaged in anything at the time other than thyroid hormone research. So it did, tell me I should keep my ideas to myself until I was in a position or even after, beginning to do the actual research.
Right, and it must have been quite a shock for you. Tell me if unless I'm mistaken, when you started doing these DMT trials, and people were telling you, like, I went to another dimension, or I met these beings, and you described the sort of the struggle within you of being like, I don't believe you, but that even caused conflict in the experiments, right? I mean, was it like a seamless process for you to start to like look at like maybe there is another dimension, right? Because you were skeptical at first.
Yeah, I mean, the stories were really unusual, and it was hard for me to accept them at face value. But that's what the volunteers reported back to me, face value. And this is what they saw, this is what they felt, this is what they heard. This is how they felt about it. Um, so yeah, I was interpreting all the trips through either one of three theoretical lenses. Either the purely psychopharmacological one, this is your brain on drugs, or the psychological one, which is, oh, these are just representations of psychological processes, impulses or drives, conflicts. And the Buddhist perspective, which I brought to bear on the study, also, even though it didn't specifically describe the content of the experiences as unconscious representations of this or that, they still posited that the experiences were in a way delusional. They really weren't true. They were more things that the mind sprung up or unleashed or released on the way towards the goal of the true enlightened state, which was formless, no content, no thoughts, no feelings. So each of those three perspectives posited the unreality of what volunteers were undergoing. Even though I never told people point blank, oh, that can't be, I was skeptical, and I kept it to myself, but I must have expressed it in what I said or how I looked. Yeah, so at a certain point, I just did a thought experiment and said to myself, well, you know, what if these are real, independent, freestanding, objective, alternative, layers of reality? If that was the case, then what? Let's explore what that's like rather than, testing whether it's true or not. Once I came to that approach, volunteers were more comfortable sharing some of the stranger aspects of their experiences. Because I think, my skeptical, unconscious communications with them, probably inhibited some of their freedom in really describing, some of the, highly novel, properties or aspects of what they had just undergone.
Yeah, absolutely. And based on like I was very amazed and also impressed by your ability, your flexibility to uh, you know um, play that devil's advocate and ask those questions in the thought experiment in really in both books, especially while you're going through the trials, because you were able to collect more information by doing that and expand the possibilities into something so much bigger. And today, now after so many years has gone by and you've written several books and you've been with this for a long time, I wonder, like, has your perspective changed, or how do you feel about, like, more specifically, like, where people go when they take psychedelics? Like, what is your understanding at the moment?
Well, I think the psychedelic experience takes place in one's individual mind. And that individual mind is a confluence of experiences, brain biology, psychology, genes, the genetic makeup. So at one state of health, what you've read, what you haven't read, what you've done with your life. So all of those things determine your mind. Those determine the quality of your mind at the time you take a psychedelic drug. And, the mind is where the trip plays out. So if it's completely internally generated, this is your brain on drugs, it's being played out in your mind. If you're perceiving some freestanding level of reality, it's still playing out in your mind. the perception of this coffee cup is taking place in my mind. So, whether or not these are real alternative universes or purely the product of brain chemistry, I don't think we can answer it. At first I was skeptical, and then I was a believer. And, now I'm kind of at the point of saying, we just don't know. It's really hard to test. But in the meantime, we need to make the most of our psychedelic experiences, no matter where the information comes from. So that's sort of where I've taken the question. In a way, it doesn't matter because it's still up to us what we do with that information.
Right. You described many times the if so, so what question. And I really like that. Just asking the question, like, okay, if all of this is true and there are all these multiple dimensions and, that the pineal gland can give you glimpses into them, so what? What does it mean? And I often wonder if that would have like paradigm shattering consequences if it were true, for any mainstream religion, ideology, spirituality, and even our political systems and our social systems, how all of that would change if suddenly there was an open acknowledgement of the access to higher dimensions, right? But I think that the approach that you've taken here seems it's very grounded in a practicality, and I think that's also very appreciated probably by a lot of mainstream academics today, to be able to explore this and not jump to conclusions either way.
Well, I think because the experiences are so dependent, or they're completely dependent on your mind, your own personal psyche. I'm not sure if it's always the case you're accessing higher dimensions. You could be accessing lower dimensions. Mm-hmm. So that's where the notion of, intellectual, moral, ethical scaffolding is so important, because it can, kind of provide feedback for whether you're going off the rails or you're, actually expanding the discussion.
Right. Well, and I'm certain that you're very probably familiar with the all the documents and everything that came out about MK Ultra and these like mind control kind of experiments that the government has done, or the CIA has done in secret, that used LSD to program people's minds and change their thought patterns and everything. So it's really, I think, important that you speak to this on that both positive and negative level, and making the most out of it by, tweaking the set and setting, because it can go either way. You can have a bad trip and a good trip.
Well, those studies of MK Ultra and, dosing army recruits, those really weren't demonstrating any ability to change people's minds. The early studies were just to, see what happened. Give this drug, see what happens. No informed consent. Just kind of hear and get back to us. The studies where they tried to use psychedelics to turn people into assassins, the Manchurian Project kind of, or the Manchurian Candidate, kinds of, scenarios, those were not successful because I think you need to already be a latent serial killer to become a serial killer on LSD. If you're nowhere at all inclined to become a serial killer, there's no way LSD is going to turn you into that. Look at Charles Manson and the way that he used LSD and his followers. They were psychopaths. They were violent. They were aggressive. They felt like they'd been hard done by by society. They wanted a model and a belief system that gave their lives meaning, and so Manson gave LSD to them and inculcated or indoctrinated them this very strange worldview called helter skelter, and it involved, killing celebrities, especially if they were white. So you take enough LSD, you hear about that, and you go, damn, that's exactly what I want to do. That's what I want to be. So these kind of inchoate, psychopaths became, dedicated to a cause. I don't think a normal person in that situation would have succumbed in that way. Those were, nefarious studies that the government did. So it goes, they were halted. A lot of damage was probably done, probably not much good obtained from those studies. Makes a lot more, sense to, carefully screen your volunteers, recruit them, supervise their sessions, be available for help if they need it.
Right, right. Well, and you've talked about this too, of like between the set and the setting, making sure that, even the environment, the setting is really quality. And, you of course did your experiments in a university hospital, and people had all these wires and stuff hooked up to them and everything. And, as I was going through DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, I was wondering, like, you were comparing the DMT experience to the prophetic state in the ancient times and everything in these old writings, and kind of finding a lot of ways that they're connected and some ways that they aren't. And I was wondering that if the setting had changed, like if you hadn't done those experiments in a hospital, but like in a sacred temple that was thousands of years old, how do you think that would have changed the quality of the experience or created more prophetic meaning as opposed to maybe more mundane or less prophetic experiences after the fact?
I think for the DMT study, we were giving it IV. It was really intense and really short, and it could be terrifying. So I think the fact that that the studies took place in a hospital with a code team nearby and all of the medical backup, in a way was reassuring. But with the psilocybin work we began, that room was terrible. For the psilocybin work, the ward was terrible. But when I tried to get that research taken off of or out of the hospital onto cozy house the university owned in the nearby neighborhood, that didn't work. So that was one of the reasons I started closing things down, was because the longer acting drugs, we really didn't have a good place to give them. But I suppose, I mean, if you're smoking DMT, which is the normal way, the normal way most people use it, even though it's short-lived and intense, I think if you're in a very conducive atmosphere, you'll have a response or an experience that's consistent or resonating with that space. If you smoke DMT or took LSD in the first temple or the second temple, let's say, you would need to be a particular kind of person to be allowed there in the first place. And that person that you were would have been, devout and quite conversant with the language, with the ritual, with the texts, with the experiences that may be, minor degrees. So you're set, who you are, would be that much more, would be that much more amenable to making the most of a change in the setting.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. I think that even for myself, some of the psychedelic experiences that I've had really opened up with to the information that I was the most privy to. So after studying Hermeticism and ancient Egyptian mythology, I had a 4-day ayahuasca journey where I met, Thoth, the god of wisdom, and he was just right there working with me, very consistently. And I often wonder, is this, a result of just because I did the research, or did I open myself up by doing the research to have that visitation, right? Or is this all just playing out within me? And it's so fascinating though, like what we can learn when we embrace it, but with that benevolent intention.
Right. Well, a few months ago, I was, doing an interview, and I was asked a good question, which was, how do you make your psychedelic experiences more spiritual? And I said, well, be a more spiritual person. If you have got a background that you're studying, that you love, that affects you in a certain way, then that material is bound to come up and be further clarified. You might be more convinced of its truth than you were before. You might develop, you might develop new insights around some of the things that you already knew. So that's, that all is the framework, the groundwork for optimizing a psychedelic experience. For example, the complete opposite, would be you're drunk, you're on speed, you're in, downtown Toronto at 3 a.m. You're depressed, your girlfriend just left you. You have a warrant out for your arrest, and a friend says, "Here's some LSD. Would you like to take some?" Yeah, so that's going to be a very different experience than if you've been studying, Gnosticism, and practicing, believing in it, preparing. It'd be completely different.
Very interesting. And that was kind of funny too, like the oddly specific example of the guy in Toronto. But I mean, I fully agree with that. That's been my experience too, of just it seems as though it amplifies your consciousness wherever that's at. Does that sound resonant to you? Does that like make sense to your experiences?
Yeah, Stan Groff a long time ago proposed that psychedelics are non-specific mental amplifiers of the unconscious. But I think it's even more expansive than that. They're non-specific amplifiers of consciousness, of both your conscious mind and your unconscious mind. You know, according to Freud, who coined those three, or the three terms: the what's conscious, what's preconscious, and what's unconscious. Conscious is what you're aware of. Preconscious is kind of at the tip of your tongue, like what was the name of that person, or if I think about something, it'll come to me. If it's unconscious, it's completely unavailable to conscious awareness. All you can see are its repercussions. For example, conflicts between people. You might feel anxious around somebody, but but not know why. That information would be contained in the unconscious, but you just don't really know about it. So in Stan describing psychedelics as amplifying the unconscious, which means unconscious material becomes conscious, and you can work with it, either think about it or experience the emotions that are that are associated with it. It also amplifies what's conscious and what's preconscious. Not specifically amplify, or not exactly amplify, but make what's already in your mind that you are aware of more true, or you're more convinced of its truth, or you're more attached to it. You're more invested in it. So you may think to yourself, well, I'd like to believe in God. So you're thinking about it, and then you trip, and you experience something that seems to you like God, and you now believe in God, and then you take that newfound firm belief in your everyday life, and then start exploring where it may lead to. So it could be conscious material, like in the example of the Manson group. all those things in their minds were already there, but they just became more convinced of their truth and the necessity the necessity to act them out, and in a positive way too. If you want to do something, let's say that you just can't quite get yourself to do, like go back to school, and you trip and you're convinced of the goodness, the rightness, the inevitability of going back to school. And, then you work that out later.
Wow. I love that, actually. I think, I mean, what you just described is, it mirrors, I think, this discovery by the Institute of Noetic Sciences and Dr. Dean Radin and his work, who recently came out with this, it was a few years ago now. I remember this presentation that he gave where they basically had come up with the evidence through experiments that it's intention that steers reality. And this is very familiar even to the ayahuasca experiences that I've had at the various shamanic locations that I've done that, is that they'll often say that, look, it's not the medicine, it's not the psychedelic, it's that your intention is steering the potency of the plant medicine, of the psychedelic drug. And so it basically describes, I mean, even just what you just said seems to really line up with that very well, of like, it's really your intention, and whatever you're trying to create, whether positive or negative, or belief in God or disbelief in God, the psychedelic will help you in giving that a thumbs up. If that's, would you say that that's accurate?
Well, it'll clarify your intention. Most people, if they are aware of it or not, are following through on their intention to be happy, to be rich, to be sexy, to travel. That's their intention. So you want to clarify your intention before you trip. You really want to pare it down, or at least bring it front and center at least. And then on the psychedelic, you'll examine it from different perspectives, which weren't available previously. So you may change your mind. You may decide, that intention is bogus, and one that you were thinking maybe you might want to switch to become more spiritual, let's say, now takes, center stage, whereas before it was to, travel or make a lot of money.
That's a really good point, actually. Wow. Yeah, so it's not just, it's well, clarifying your main intention, but also maybe all the deeper subconscious things that are within you. That makes perfect sense. One of the things that I was also reflecting on in DMT and the Soul of Prophecy was, speaking to the connection to the ancient prophets of the Old Testament, and these connections, these striking connections. You wrote a little bit about how there are some who theorize that the what's it called, manna in the Bible was actually mushrooms, or was maybe a psychedelic, or that some the burning bush maybe was like the acacia tree and stuff like this with various DMT substances. And I'm wondering, like, more specifically from you, like, with your awareness and all of this research that you've done, how do you do you think that these Old Testament writers had some form of psychedelic, or do you think that they were facilitating an endogenous experience, or was it something completely different that's not even psychedelic related?
Well, to the extent that the prophetic visions are similar to DMT visions, it makes sense that endogenous DMT may play a role. And we learned just last year that the brain makes DMT in rather high quantities, comparable to serotonin and dopamine. So there seems to be a DMT neurotransmitter system in the mammalian brain whose function is just going to begin to be understood. But, be that as it may, in the Prophetic States book, I do a side-by-side comparison of the DMT experience and the prophetic experience. And as I mentioned earlier, I define prophecy as any spiritual experience in the Hebrew Bible. The most memorable are the visions of Moses, let's say, or Ezekiel or Jeremiah, Daniel especially. Um, so I compared the phenomenology, the visions, the colors, the movement in the visions, the feelings, the sounds, uh, the bodily sensations, the emotions, and there's quite striking overlap. So to the extent that the phenomenology of the two experiences overlap, there must be some. Well, not must be, but it makes sense. That DMT is playing a role. Um, the evidence for the figures in the text taking in substances from the outside is pretty meager. Um, there's no visions. Well, there's the incense, but there's only one very abstruse reference to the possibility of the incense revealing or helping reveal God's glory, and it only occurs one time in one person. One time a year. For one person. Moses is burning bush. That was one guy, one time. The manna. There wasn't any manna. During the time of Ezekiel and Jeremiah or Daniel. There's. There isn't much evidence in the text for taking in exogenous substances, and we already have got a source of DMT, which is the brain. Whether or not DMT levels rose in the brains of the prophetic figures in the text, we'll never know. But is an interesting question, and I think it is relevant for contemporary spiritual experience.
Yes. Yeah, I know I would agree with that. And do you think there's a relationship though to, when we go back and look at other ancient cultures around the time, especially the ancient Greeks we know of with their mystery schools, we know that they did do psychedelic practices of sorts. We know about certain ancient Egyptian plants as well as the mysterious kykeon, and then there's soma in India, and these sort of mysterious, what seemed to be very psychedelic brews. Would it make sense then that if it was happening in Greece and India and ancient Egypt, it's all very kind of localized in that area, even if it didn't make it into the text, that perhaps that there was this connection in the Old Testament as well? Or do you think that one's more an isolated experience where the actual deities were showing up and maybe that was triggering the DMT and the endogenous DMT for them to be able to see those beings? You know what I mean?
Right. Well, there's a couple of arguments that would go against that proposal, or that idea, or a couple of ideas anyway that would militate against that. One is, as I mentioned, there's really no textual evidence for the use of substances, and if it were that crucial,
right,
it would be mentioned. Like the Greeks mention it, the Egyptians mention it, the Hindus mention it. If it were important, to the ancient Hebrews, I would guess it would have appeared in the text. The other is the unique aspect of Judaism, or of the ancient Hebrew religion as articulated in the Hebrew Bible.
right.
It's one God. There's no intermediaries. There's just you and God, or the prophet anyway. But there's no, there's there's using substances in the Hebrew Bible as seen through that mindset would be idolatry. It would be paganism. It would be the Canaanite religion, ecstatic intoxication, in order to approach, the local gods, to thank them or, request things from them. So the text of the Hebrew Bible is quite explicit. Only, YHVH, only the Lord. That's the only thing you sacrifice to. The only thing you revere, the only thing you love, the only thing you serve. So I think it's both. It's the psychology of the ancient Hebrews, and I just don't think there's any evidence textually.
No, that's completely fair. And then I guess on that note, though, if someone today took a psychedelic with that intention to connect with just Yod He Vav He or YHVH, the one true God, and said that's my intention, they could potentially still do that, right?
Technically speaking, I think so. Theologically speaking, it would be a stretch because prophecy is supposed to have ended, during the middle, Second Temple period, 150 BCE, or something around that time. So classical prophecy is supposed to have ended, but still, I mean, the prophetic stream, the prophetic experience, visionary experience, is fundamental to Hasidic belief and practice. The Zohar is really psychedelic, studied by Kabbalists, Jewish and non-Jewish.
Right.
So, you'd have to distinguish then, even if you have crossed all your T's and you've dotted all of your I's, and you have what you might consider a prophetic experience consistent with the Hebrew Bible, the teachings, the beliefs, the practices, then you would have to distinguish, is this true prophecy or false prophecy? That gets to be pretty, pretty subjective. Although there are, some guidelines, whether or not what you are bringing back from the experience is consistent with the text, with one God and the golden rule. And if you were living a virtuous life, you weren't some kind of, aggressive degenerate. But at the same time, the question of, where the elevated, DMT or other brain activating, chemicals come from is a key question. In true prophecy, it's downward. God, as it were, stimulates the activity of your brain in a certain way in order for communication to occur. It's a mission. You're called to it. In the case of a contemporary psychedelic drug user, the elevated level of brain activity is from below. You take a substance and then your brain chemistry changes. So the mechanism is totally different, even though, the content and the meaning and information, might overlap significantly.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting. More of a personal question, actually. I remember that when you were writing DMT, the spirit molecule, you had described that up until the point of doing all those experiments, you hadn't taken any psychedelic yourself. That's correct, right?
No, I took a ton of psychedelics in college, and then in my 30s for about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, it was just during the trials, I suppose, then, that you stayed very clean, right?
Well, I wouldn't let any of my staff use psychedelics with the volunteers, but other than that, people were free to lead their lives, normally. Why do you ask? Where is this question going?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I forgive me, I was mistaken. I thought that you hadn't done psychedelics up until that point. But my question was, I wanted to ask you about perhaps, I mean, do you have, if you're open to sharing it, of course, what was perhaps one of the most insightful or enlightening or transformative psychedelic experiences that you've ever had?
Well, the one experience that I specifically talk about is the first time I smoked DMT, which was in 86 or 87. Terrence McKenna sat for me. And, I actually, fib a bit. The epilogue of the DMT book is my trip that took place under, Terrence's, watchful gaze. I described the volunteer as a 36-year-old psychologist or something. But that's, my experience. And
Okay.
yeah, it was pretty transformative. It started working real quickly. I laid down and I beheld this raging waterfall of color, this waterfall made of raging color. And out of the waterfall emerged these 3 or 4 beings that were about 3 or 4 feet high. And they were singing, sing song. They were looking at me, and in this sing song kind of way, said, "Now do you see? Now do you see? Now do you see?" Over and over again. And I was just slack jawed, like, what is this? Yeah, and it started to fade, and I opened my eyes, felt my hands, looked around, and stopped the melatonin work about a month after that and moved into actually trying to get the DMT study off the ground.
Wow. I mean, I have several questions from that, actually. I do remember that story, especially there's the "now do you see? Now do you see?" That stands out in my mind. So I think, regarding prophecy, for the question at the very beginning, and you were saying it depends on how you define prophecy, and you expanded it to include sort of the spiritual experience. It seems to me, and again, this is just my elementary perception at the moment, that it's sort of as like your life has been, the series of events that brought about this research, and that in and of itself is a little bit prophetic, even if it's not necessarily like future telling, but was like the significant spiritual research that helped pioneer a new kind of science, really. That's what it appears to me to look like, that whether you were in the right place at the right time, but for a very specific purpose, from, not just a coincidence, is I guess what I'm getting at.
Right. Well, there are no coincidences, right? But still, I kind of get your drift about the, now do you see? I mean, I've been kind of restless intellectually, creatively over my life. Started out with, thyroid, then melatonin, then DMT, now the Hebrew Bible. And, then, the most recent thing is this autobiographical novel that I wrote last year, Joseph Levy Escapes Death. So I've just kind of gone where the data leads me, or, where the data is and I'm curious about it, I'll just, follow the data with that kind of curiosity. It's been rather exhausting. I probably won't live all that much longer, but still, certain things intrigue me, and then I just apply, my focus on taking them as far as I can. With the DMT work, it was kind of obvious, but not that obvious because it was so far ahead of its time. But I wanted to give psychedelics. Terrence and I met one day at his home in Sebastopol, and we spent all day in his library. What do we do? How do we get this field off the ground again? This was 1988, and Terrence, loved DMT. The first wave of interest in the drug is due to his influence, and we just kind of came across this idea. This was the height of the war on drugs, 1988 in the U.S., and so we just kind of came to this conclusion: well, give DMT with money that you get from the war on drugs. And instead of saying you want to study DMT because it's really cool and far out, say you want to study DMT because it's an abused psychedelic. It might be involved in the genesis of schizophrenia. So it was like a decision to go into the lion's den, kind of a bureaucratic judo. Yeah, and if if it weren't for my training and clinical research background, it wouldn't have flown. But I applied the experiences and the education I had garnered up until then to put together a pretty banal protocol in a way. Just give DMT and see what happens, which we would have done in either event if it was a good drug or a bad drug. In terms of the Hebrew Bible and being at the right place at the right time, in a way, it's a response to this mystical unitive mania that's kind of gripped the psychedelic research community. It's all about attaining to the one. And most people's psychedelic experiences are not that. And even though attaining that state in a research environment is useful, that isn't to say that an interactive prophecy like experience wouldn't be as useful. So in a way, I needed some other spiritual model upon which to base an understanding of the psychedelic experience and a way to get the most out of it. So I'm Jewish. I had parted ways with my Zen Buddhist community, and I thought, well, I'll just start reading the Bible. Once I got into it, which wasn't easy, but once I got into it, there's this thing which is called prophecy, and it sure sounded like a DMT experience, and it's the most important religious experience in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is the basis of all three major Western religions. It's the underpinning of Western civilization. Economy, philosophy, architecture, law, politics. So it's kind of like, oh, there's this book. And it really fits to a T the phenomenology of the DMT effect. And it's this hugely powerful book with incredible influence. It isn't a mystical unitive state, it's quite specific. There's a lot of, it's verbal. It's a verbal experience. It's cognitive. It isn't a white light, which you then apply ideas to after the fact. It is a verbal information full experience. So in a way, the Prophetic States book, was a reaction against the mystical unitive mania, but also one that was more consistent with, the data from my studies and most people's psychedelic experiences.
Totally. Yeah. I appreciated too, like how at the very beginning of the book, you explained that most people who are into psychedelics of any kind, at least as it relates to spirituality, are far more interested in the Eastern paths as opposed to the Western biblical kind of study and those kind of paths. And just being able to draw that line actually was very remarkable, to be able to see, oh, you're completely right. Like the generally speaking, those who fall into using psychedelics, it all kind of becomes this mixture of Eastern philosophy and spirituality. And you also explain where that came from, like how psychedelics and the Buddhism and Eastern spiritualities kind of like came to the West right around the same time, kind of got muddled in with each other because they're exotic. They have more appeal than where you come from. And that was just really just eye-opening. But at the same time, throughout the course of this book, you gave a very powerful reason to look into the Bible with a mystical perspective, with a slightly more looking at it in a rather than this orthodox, traditional, almost dogmatic kind of way. It's just like flexibility, but still getting into it. And I mean, that must have taken a lot of work, as you just said. It wasn't easy, but once you got into it, I mean, the revelations were profound.
Oh, it was a huge project. From beginning to end, it was 18 years. And the first 10 years, I think, I was just, reading. The first, 10 years was just, reading the commentaries, reading the text over and over and over again. And at a certain point, I figured I needed to put my money where my mouth was and actually start doing that head-to-head comparison. And I'll tell you, I was so relieved that it worked out, that, oh yeah, they really are, when you really take a careful, good look at both, they're really quite similar. Um, so yeah, it was a long project. And in terms of the Eastern versus, the Western approach, I think, one of the appealing, features of, the Eastern approach, or it isn't even the Eastern approach, it's the mystical unitive approach. It could be, Christianity, it could be, Gnosticism, but, just being merged with the one, with the white light. You can just make up what you want when you come down. You could say, it means this, it means that. Oh, that must be what this represents. So, because the content, or, because the experience is content free, cognition free, it's really prone to abuse by unscrupulous types, or even if you're just uneducated or, psychologically unsophisticated. In the case of the Hebrew Bible, it's a text which emerges from the prophetic experience. It's a prophetic text. It was written by prophets or those inspired by prophecy. It's the account of the lives, or it's the, narratives of the lives of the prophets and their experiences and their interactions, their visions, their, suggestions for a good life, what to think, what to believe, what to do. So it's verbal. Prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, it isn't really, the visions. It's the information that, that the visions contain and that the prophet transmits. So it's information. So you're not as free to say, you should use honest weights and balances. That's one of the precepts in the text. Honest weights and balances. So you can't, and that is a prophetic utterance. There's Moses, and he's speaking to the Hebrews, saying, thus spoke Adonai, have proper weights and balances. So you can't say, oh, proper weights and balances. That's just a metaphor for X, Y, and Z. It's really quite clear cut. So I think people with an anti-authoritarian bent of any sort would chafe against anything specific like that. It isn't, it isn't moral relativism. It's really quite clear cut. These are things that are good to do because they will benefit you and please God. And these are the things that are bad to do that will cause you and others harm, that will irritate God. So, take it or leave it. But it's really not something you can apply, layers and layers of your own personal interpretation to.
I completely get that. Do you think that it's, though, more of a result of the individual than it is the difference between the psychedelic or this other endogenous method by which the ancient prophets had their experience? Because I imagine that if someone was really, like, as you described, preparing yourself for prophecy is having a very prominent both intellect and ability to exercise your imagination. And when you have both of those really, good and intertwined but elevated, you have more capacity to receive. So do you think that it's more of like, if someone just takes a psychedelic, if they don't have a strong imagination or a high intellect, the ego, upon returning from that journey, will be like, oh, well, it meant this and this and that. They'll just make it up. Whereas for someone who has an elevated mind, that they could actually receive the genuine truth of what it meant and surrender to that, as opposed to filling in the gaps themselves?
Well, I think, the better developed your intellect is from study and a virtuous life, and the better developed your imagination is, which is where I think, psychedelics may play a role. Then you're bound to get, more out of the experiences and to less likely go off half-cocked. So, yeah, I would say that's the case no matter what. If you're seeking prophetic experiences or, creativity enhancement, or, psychological, relationship, or, relationship issues that you want to clarify. So I think, yeah. Yeah, I think I will leave it at that.
Just speaking a little bit to your personal DMT experience with the beings that said, now do you see? As well as, all of the other beings that, you've recorded experiments about with other people, and even the things in the Bible. I'm wondering, it's like you've spoken about that question of, is it outside of you? Is it inside of you? There seems to be some consistency sometimes with seeing certain kinds of beings. Does it seem? I mean, based on your research, does it seem to be like the entire universe, or the multiverse, or just this whole reality field is just like so densely populated with life, and maybe even a little bit of irony that we're always wondering, like, are we alone in the universe? And you take one psychedelic and you can meet so many different beings. Is that funny or interesting to you?
Well, it's kind of, yeah, it's, I think anybody that has any, well, yeah, well, the issue of, dreams is interesting. The Sonoy in in Malaysia, I think, a tribe. They put more credence in the dream world than the world of waking consciousness. So there are indications, depending on how much attention you want to direct, toward them. That it's it is an well, that there is a spiritual level, to reality, things which are normally invisible, which we can then access in an altered state, either through dreams, um, or through psychedelics or other technologies. Um, but still, I think, on the face of it, the nature of that spiritual uh, level is still impossible to objectively, shall we say, determine. Is it completely generated by our mind, which is the bottom-up approach, or is it just perceived by the mind, which is the top-down approach? Um, I think in the case of Hebrew Bible prophecy, it's top-down, because that's what it says. And if you believe the text, that's what the implication is. But in the contemporary world, the contemporary spiritual experience, uh, we really can't say. There's no objective way of determining that. I believe, that is both. That our ability to perceive things which exist outside of us is dependent on our state of development. So if you have a clear window, you could see things out there relatively clearly. If it's a blurry, dirty window, even though those things are out there, you're projecting a lot onto it because you can't make it out that well. So I think
Yeah.
it's a balance.
Sorry, you got me smiling so much here because you reminded me of it's one sentence in your book, in the new one, that said specifically whether it was like asking the question of whether you'd be, if you'd be seeing a glass, like a window, or a mirror, and if you'd be looking inside of yourself versus looking through it. And I love that you just added the detail in there in terms of the quality of the mirror slash glass, of like how clearly you're seeing through or seeing yourself. And I think that's a really valuable thing for people to be able to conceptualize. Like, a way of conceptualizing the psychedelic is that maybe that's how you can define it, is it either becomes a window or a mirror, and based on your set, your consciousness will determine if it's a clear lens or a very foggy or dirty kind of thing. That's amazing. Thank you.
It's a spectrum in a way. When I was talking about the clear glass, versus the mirror, those are the two polar opposites. But along the lines of what we were just talking about, I think it's more of a spectrum. That the glass is,
Hmm.
more or less clear. And the less clear it is, the more you have to project your own stuff onto it.
Right. Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's really good. And I mean, it seems as though then, like, there, this is, tell me if this resonates with you, because you've spoken a lot about how the Zen Buddhist path didn't really work in line with your psychedelic research. And having, my own experiences is kind of very similar to yours in the sense I have really explored and taken, I mean, not 10 years worth of straight study of the Bible, but I've looked at and been with various parables and stories in the Bible and played with that, and also have gone and done a lot of, the Zen meditative Eastern practices. And I find that there is a value to the Zen meditation and this kind of thing, because it allows you to kind of like clear up your window, or clear up your mirror, and to practicing that like empty state is like clearing your mind of, or making sense of everything that's going on in your mind, so that everything is clear and you can see clearly into the other worlds that then we translate to the Bible and start getting, like meeting with mystical beings. And even though you've separated from the Zen Buddhist church, or if it's a church, if it's a temple, the faith, would you say that there's still a value to both, and that they could potentially work in tandem with each other for different purposes?
Well, I think they can, uh, but you have to recognize the slippery slope, because meditation. Well, Buddhist meditation, Zen meditation, Vipassana, mindfulness. Those all emerge from Buddhism, which is a religion with a worldview, an understanding of the individual and the understanding of the outside spiritual world. Well, the outside world, both spiritual and material. Um, so
I
those,
see.
practices are not, theology free, even though contemporary mindfulness types want to say, well, it's just a psychological thing. It is psychological, but it's from Buddhist psychology, the Visuddhimagga and the structure of the mind as laid down in Buddhism. So those practices are based in Buddhism, which is a religion, which has ideas about the afterlife, the good life, the bad life, what to think, how to act. So once you start meditating, well, for example, I mean, I wanted to learn, to meditate, so I went to the monastery. But it isn't that you just, meditate. You're taught Buddhism, which is a certain view of the mind, a certain view of the body, and so on. So Buddhism practices, or depending on the sect, there's bowing to statues and to people, and there's praying to dead ancestors and spirits. So that's Buddhism. You can't really separate that from Buddhism. And mindfulness, Vipassana, Zen, those are all Buddhist. So in any event, it's a technique, but it's a technique very closely tied to a belief system. So if you can separate the two, I mean, that's good, because you can clear your mind. I think when you start reading the Hebrew Bible, it's very stressful. There's God, there's Israel, there's Adam and Eve, there's sin. I mean, it's quite difficult. So one of the ways I think you can overcome those emotional reactions is through sitting. Just sit. When you're reading, read. When you're carrying water, carry water. When you're studying the text, just study the text. You don't bring anything else in. And I think that's a good, that's a good use of mind training meditations. Like I still sit every night before I go to bed. If I wake up in the middle of the night and I can't get back to sleep, I'll count my breaths. So I still do practice meditation. It's interesting though, when I was at the studying with under the supervision of the monastery, We studied a Zen teacher named Dogen, who lived in the 1200s. And I really loved to read Dogen. His character is great. I loved him as a character. His writings are beautiful. We recited them every day. Zazen instructions, how to do Zazen. Um, but I was just, reading one of his works just a few weeks ago, and it seemed really different. He's kind of, lauding, peasants who pray to the Buddhas and who carve Buddha statues and who, bow to the Buddha statues. He was really talking that up. And I understand where he's coming from, but it's not Jewish. And it's, paganism, it's idolatry, it's kind of like idol worship in a way. So that's not to, say there might not be some good effects from all of that, but it isn't, Jewish. And having immersed myself in the tradition and the text for so long, they're really quite different.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting too is I found a lot of cases where and just this is just me knowing a lot of people and seeing this happen with a lot of people, is that oftentimes it's like when you're growing up, if you're raised in a traditional path, whatever path that is, there comes a point where oftentimes that person will like kind of fall away from it, try another path, do some other things, explore another area of life, and then kind of come back to the thing that they originally were raised in and find a new appreciation with it. So the fact that it also happened with you and you found so much value because of your the science experiments have been, that's really, really cool to have happen. And I think that it's will make it a lot more appealing for people who are, more traditionally Orthodox Jewish or even Christian or even Muslim to be able to like embrace the psychedelic experience perhaps a little more. Have you found that that's the case? Like, have you found a lot of maybe new, Christian or Jewish people who came to you and were like, wow, I never thought about it like that. I've never embraced psychedelics, but you opened my mind. Has that happened?
In the beginning, I got a lot of email from Christians who liked the ideas in the book. And then, Muslims, I hear from a few Muslims here and there. The Jews were slow to the discussion. But there is a group now, the Jewish Entheogenic Society. It's a Facebook group. And they want to integrate Jewish practice and study with the psychedelic experience. And so I've gotten to know some of the people there, spoke to them at a Zoom event a few months ago. So I think it's going to start picking up. Remains to be seen what form it'll take, but it's encouraging.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, on that note too, like one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about was like, where do you see this going in terms of, humanity accepting psychedelics or looking at it with a little bit more, just seriousness and taking it seriously? Where do you see it going? And then what would be like the ideal or optimal state of relationship that humans should have or ideally would have in an ideal circumstance with psychedelic drugs?
Well, let's focus on the first part of that question. So maybe you could unpack that a bit.
Sorry. Yes. Where do you see all of this going? Like humans' use of psychedelics in a modern day setting. What does it look like from your vantage point where you're sitting?
Modern humans taking psychedelics. What's the best? Well, it just depends. It depends what you're looking for. Education is key. Prepare yourself. Develop yourself first. I mean, no matter what you want to get out of them, religious or spiritual insights, creative, solutions, enjoyment of nature. You want to, set those things up. You should have them in place first. as part of your everyday life. So when you trip, you get the most out of your experiences. Um, so, I think, psychedelics, though, in general, the science spirituality interface, I think it's going to get really strange if people start to uh, consider seriously the existence of endogenous DMT, that the brain makes a lot of DMT, as much serotonin or dopamine. So, what does that mean? Well, I think it has to do with what we were talking about, that things that were subliminal or kind of not that well formed become real and solid and convincing. I think in a way, that is a placebo effect, a psychological placebo effect. Things that you're hoping for occur as a result of taking a drug. Well, so that also carries out into more objective measures. Like depression, you give psilocybin in the right environment, and depression improves. But you take psilocybin, or you give it in any number of environments, and you get this innumerable quantity of effects. You are more creative, you're more open. It helps with depression, OCD, eating disorders, domestic disputes, prisoner recidivism, music and nature appreciation. Um, you know, Anything you're looking for a psychedelic to do, at least in the mind or in the mind body complex, psychosomatic conditions. You give a psychedelic in the accordingly supervised and steered sessions in circumstances, you will see those responses that you're looking for. And I think that indicates a placebo effect. I think the psychedelics are super placebos. Which isn't to say that the changes that you see aren't objective. Placebo effect is biological. If you have placebo pain relief, you give Narcan, and that pain relief goes away. So placebo anesthesia is mediated by endorphins. You can measure that. So the improvements that you see in any number of things indicates a more basic placebo enhancing effect of psychedelics, in which the natural healing mechanisms of the mind and brain are activated. So you're activating your own healing mechanisms through a psychedelic drug, either psychological healing mechanisms or physical ones. So when you think about a DMT neurotransmitter system, if there is a DMT neurotransmitter system, what would it be responsible to mediate? With serotonin, systems regulate mood, aggression, impulsivity. Dopamine ones mediate reward. Norepinephrine ones mediate activation. So what would a DMT neurotransmitter system mediate? Well, what's the hallmark of the DMT effect? It's more real than real. That is what everybody, or most everybody, came back with, and that's most people's experiences. It's more real than real. So what you apprehend in that state, really, sears itself into your memories. It's the most intense experience of your life, one you will never forget. For example, in the film, the DMT documentary, keep in mind that some of those interviews took place 18 years. 18 years? No, 17 years after their last DMT experience. And if you're listening to them, it's as if they tripped like yesterday or the day before. It's it's still quite fresh. So things so things experienced, apprehended, viewed in the mind, in the presence of elevated levels, high levels of DMT, are quite important. They're quite real. They're what you orient your life around in some ways. So if you think about reality and who people are, what they're like, what motivates them, what do they believe in, it could be that the experiences they have when they're young that elevate levels of DMT become convincingly true. And those which aren't, that are not associated with elevated in endogenous DMT don't bear as much of an impact. So it starts to get kind of weird. Things start to break, down in a way. And is it all, is it all relative? Obviously not, because things are pretty consistent in everyday reality. So then you start wondering about outside organizing influences. How is the whole thing held together, and in what direction, and why? So I think it'll become a real rabbit hole once people start seriously considering the implications of endogenous DMT.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and you wrote a lot about the possibility of dark matter in the DMT and the spirit molecule, being like, maybe this is where people are going. Like it's a question mark, right? We don't know, because we don't know what dark matter is. But you started to explore these, other realms, other places, asking like, where are people going? And that was one area of inquiry that was really very fascinating, that I was particularly taken with, because I was also learning some of astrophysics at the time, and just trying to wrap my head around that. And so you drew a lot of lines here, and it would make sense, wouldn't it, if you like, the DMT could be a glimpse, not just into yourself, but maybe this dark matter dimension, or what have you.
Right. If you're looking, for a location of the worlds that are usually invisible, dark matter is a good place to look as any. 95, depending on the most recent calculations, 95% of the mass of the universe is dark. We can't see it. It doesn't generate or reflect light. So, you would think a universe inhabited by dark matter would be inhabited, if not by individual beings, then some kind of information content. We perceive information clothed, as it were, in the imagination. You see something, you hear something, and then you make sense of it. It isn't just pure information. It's not purely verbal. That's the relationship between the imagination and intellect. The display occurs in the imagination, and then you extract the information using your intellect. Dark matter, parallel universes. If you could develop a camera that could take pictures of things in the dark matter universe, you could then compare them to the DMT state, for example, in the same person, let's say. That's, I guess,
Oh, that, yeah.
That's highly speculative, Philip K. Dick kind of stuff. But, that's, one way to look at it.
It's also just the same as if you could get, or maybe not quite the same, because it's still a little bit more subjective, but if you could get, 3 people to all do a psychedelic at the same time, and then see if they can all see the same, reality. Oh, we all saw the same spaceship, or we all saw each other in this other world, right? Like, that would lend more credence to the idea that it's not just a mirror, that they are actually, like, they went through the window, or through the door, if you would, right?
Right.
Same kind of idea.
David Luke, in the UK has studied a lot of psi phenomena, and under the influence of psychedelics, and he's not really found much. I don't know if he's done exactly that study. Take 3 people. Well, they'd have to be in separate rooms, and they all experience the same thing. Those studies have not panned out, under strict laboratory conditions. But one could argue at the same time those strict laboratory conditions are inhibiting the effect that would otherwise play itself out in a more naturalistic setting. which is the ayahuasca one. You have a group of people, tripping together on DMT, basically, and they experience, group hallucinations. So, I think the jury's still out.
Yeah. Oh, I like that you did say that it was just like a massive rabbit hole for everyone. That like when we really take it seriously, I mean, who even knows where that's going to lead us? But it's exciting nonetheless.
Well, it's kind of fraught, because it could go either way. It could be used for good. It could be used for ill. Speaking of Philip K. Dick, there's a novel by him, which is called The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And it's about two drugs, one from way outer space, like a different star system, and one that was developed on Earth. And there's a competition between the earthly forces and the interstellar forces, for domination of the human market for the drug. And they both transport you to different worlds. One is really bleak, and the other is kind of childish. So there wasn't really a third better alternative to those two, but still you get the picture. If you can start manipulating endogenous DMT in various directions, I mean, you would have a lot of influence over people.
Right. This makes me want to ask. There was another line specifically in DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, where you specifically you made a reference to some of like the revelations and the prophecies of the Bible, and sort of this coming shift, and that God will hasten it towards the end, and everything hasten the shift. The way that you said it was a mass exodus into a higher dimension, I believe was the quote. And I wanted to ask you about that. Is like, do you see or believe that as we continue to evolve as a species, that we will hit a point where there is this sort of mass exodus into a higher dimension? And then what does that mean to you, or what did that mean to you when you wrote it?
I came up with that idea as kind of a biological explanation of the rapture, of everybody kind of transcending their bodies all at once, one big long sigh. And I came up with that when I was thinking about the relationship of the gene in our DNA that that makes the enzyme responsible for DMT synthesis. What if that gene got turned on in every organism that possessed it across the planet, and there'd be a flood of DMT in every organism that contained that gene. So in a way, that would be a biological explanation of the rapture. It's not to say it's going to happen, but if it were to happen, that might be one way in which it took place. Because if there was just this huge flood of DMT and it didn't stop, at least for a while, you'd stop eating. You might die. So it would be the intermediate phase between an earthly life and a heavenly one. So I do speculate about that, somewhat in the DMT book, DMT, the spirit molecule, that individuals, when they die, they may get a preliminary glimpse of the afterlife as a result of elevated brain DMT at the time of death. So I was thinking about it on a larger scale, because of what I learned in the text about the Messiah and the messianic era. Oh, but speaking of
Yeah, definitely.
elevated brain levels at the time of death, the same study from the University of Michigan, John Dean and Jimo Borjigan, that came out last year on brain synthesis of DMT in the rodent. It also demonstrated that brain levels of DMT in the visual cortex increased quite a lot after a cardiac arrest in a rodent. So concentrations of DMT in the visual cortex increase markedly as an animal dies. So that is uh, supportive evidence. It isn't contradictory evidence in any event. That there is an increase of DMT when mammals die, and that may mediate at least some features of the near-death state. And what is the near-death state? Well, it's a near-death state. It's not it isn't the dead state, but still, it's the last thing our minds are aware of before we die. So that, I think, has to have some influence.
Definitely. I'm actually really excited because of the research that you've done, and then the other research on near death experiences, and now just more people doing the psychedelic research. Ideally, we're going to hit this critical mass where, as you said, like there would just be this general mass interest. And again, speaking to this line of the mass exodus into a higher dimension, when you said that, you were exploring how, and I have some notes here, it's just that, God will hasten it in the end, bringing it about, but that we don't necessarily, we shouldn't rush it because it's all up in God's plan, but that God himself will hasten it in the end. And it seems as though, like, for thousands of years, there's been like no real significant psychedelics. And then suddenly there's this big interest in it, and it's starting to come out, and maybe this is the part of it starting to be hastened. Maybe this is the beginning of kind of that, if it's called the rapture or the ascension, or whatever we want to call it, this big turning point for humanity, and life will never be the same. Which, I mean, do you feel the same way?
So there are a couple of relevant ideas that get conflated oftentimes. But the way that I've learned it is that there are two stages, or two two periods, which are much more spiritual than this present one. One is called the messianic era, which in a way would be like the Garden of Eden. There's resurrection, and then things are cool. The Jews can study without being hassled. That's the specific definition of the Garden of Eden in that model. But more universally, the wolf will lie down with the lamb. The lion will eat straw. So it's a time of incredible peace and productivity and of happiness. The lifespan increases to the level it was before the flood. You could live 900 years. But it all occurs physically. The laws of nature are the same. They're not really changed. So that's called the messianic era. What occurs after that is what's called the world to come, and the world to come is non-corporeal. It's completely spiritual. So what the role of DMT or psychedelics would be, I think, more along the lines of the world to come. Disembodied souls, basking in the ecstasy of the glory, or of studying Torah with Moses. So it's a more incorporeal phenomena. I don't think that psychedelics have much to say in a discussion of the Messianic era, because it's not really supernatural. It still is all occurring within the natural world and the laws of nature.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk more about the Messianic era. Is there a clear explanation from the text as you understand it as to how we get from where we are here to there, or how that comes about? If it's entirely God's plan, or is there something that has to happen for us to see that world come to be?
Yeah, well, that's a quote from Isaiah. In its time, I will hasten it. So on one level, in its time, that indicates that there is a time in the future. And the other part is that God will hasten it. Well, does that mean that God will hasten that time? Like if it's going to occur in March, will God hasten it to February? Um, or does it mean? Oh gosh, the thought slipped my mind. Well, I think it means that sooner or later it's going to happen. But it can be hastened, and how that can be hastened could be through the revival of prophecy, of the prophetic experience, which kind of flips on its head, the notion that in the messianic era there'll be a return to prophecy. But this is proposing with a return to prophecy, we will enter into the messianic era. But that's frowned upon. One of the Talmudic dictums is don't hasten the end, don't calculate the end. Daniel has got some very weird numbers about when the end will happen. When the messianic era will be upon us, and they're impossible to interpret. But that hasn't kept a lot of people from figuring, well, is it going to be 1283 AD when the end comes, or 1514? So there's a dictum that says don't calculate the end, and you shouldn't work to hasten the end either. But at the same time, right, everything that you do consistent with the text is intended to bring God's presence onto the earth to a greater extent than is the case now. So by doing good, by not doing bad, you're hastening the end in a way. I think in its time implies that things can get really bad and then there'll be a shift, or you can do it before things get really bad. But, if you look at human history, we usually wait until things get pretty bad before we start changing our ways. Yeah, I think it just, you do your best. And if you want to enhance doing your best, or thinking your best, or feeling your best using psychedelics, then I don't think there's any reason against it, just as long as you're keeping what you're doing in perspective. Don't think that you've got it figured out. Maintain.
Yeah, be humble.
Yeah, maintain peer review. That's key.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of peer review and really the scientific method, I was curious. Now, part of me looks at your work and goes, well, you've already proved this, but I don't know if this actually is legitimately proven. So I wanted to ask you, do you believe that DMT can be used to prove the existence of the soul? And identify and answer that question of what is the soul? Can we use DMT to do that scientifically and globally?
I've never really thought about that. The soul. Well, it's impossible to define the soul. You know the soul by its actions. That's a medieval notion. The soul by its actions. So either the things we think, feel, or do. That is the movement of the soul. Once you die, you have no more soul. Or once your soul leaves you, you're dead. So can you measure that using DMT somehow? Well, I think you could get in closer contact with your soul through the judicious use of psychedelics. I don't think you can prove its existence, though.
Right. That's very interesting. Yeah, because even a lot of the spiritualities that I've personally explored, a lot of even the Greek and Egyptian mysteries and such, often will talk about really that you are not the body yourself, but that the soul is clothed in a body, and that much like we're wearing shirts and pants, that the soul wears the physical body, and that in that it seems as though, it's like that idea of like, well, if the soul leaves you, you're dead. It's like, well, you are the soul that's leaving, but that the spiritual journey is a process of essentially getting the body to recognize the unity with the soul, and that like empowers you to a greater level of consciousness. But I know that that's probably a different perspective than what you're used to with the biblical stuff, right? Is there any overlap there in your understanding?
Yeah, I think that there is. As I was listening to you, I was in agreement. Yeah, well, could you, summarize that notion? And I think I'll be able to respond more precisely.
Absolutely. It's the idea that you are not just the body, but the soul is more of who you truly are. And that perhaps through the DMT experience that you can gain a deeper awareness of that spiritual soul aspect of you, and maybe even prove its existence. But that's up in the air, and you're saying maybe not. But yeah, like instead of saying that the you and the soul are separate and that the soul is inhabiting your body, rather you are that soul that is inhabiting the body that you wear in this lifetime.
Yeah, I think they're dependent on each other. The soul, the soul is behind, I guess, motivation. Well, the soul is an enlivening force. The activity of the soul as it passes through the brain is the mind. You can assume the existence of the soul, by its, workings on the brain. So that's why the mind brain complex is a convenient notion. It's a complex. They're inextricably bound to each other. No mind that they'll, if you have no brain, you have no mind. And if there's, no mind, there's no, soul. Then, the brain is, just an organ, doing its thing. That's obviously a, metaphysical approach.
Right.
But you can tarnish the soul. For example, you can decide to do something horrible, and it's horrible. That tarnishes your soul. It doesn't like there's a separation. If you do something, it affects your soul. So I don't think they're they're more interwoven. They're more interconnected than separate things.
Mm-hmm. It even reminded me of in Kabbalah, the Hebrew letters often have this sort of mystical association or idea in the translation from Aleph to the last letter. Tav. Sorry, I forgot it for a second. From Aleph to Tav, you have this sort of process of creation, and Aleph kind of representing the ethereal oneness of God, the unmanifested supremeness power, and then down to Tav being like the manifestation of the world and all of the things in there. And I remember learning about Samek, the specific letter Samek, being almost described as like a pillar that upholds that connection that you just described, the connection between the soul and the body, and that like the soul upholds the body through its power, but also that the body allows the soul to exist physically, and that they're interwoven together. And I thought that was a curious correlation, and also fits into the more Jewish line of thinking as well. So that does fit, doesn't it?
Yeah, the interesting thing about the Hebrew letters is their different perspectives. There's the letter, the sound it makes.
Right.
In the case of the Samech, it's it's an S sound. There's a number. I'm not sure what Samech would be. Maybe 90 or 80. But there's also the definition of the word. Samech. What does the word samech mean? And it means to lean, to lean your hands in particular onto something. When Moses invests, Joshua with the power to lead the Hebrews, he lays his hands on Joshua, and that verb is, and so the verb which is used to describe the laying on the hands is samech. So it has to do with support from above, it seems like, rather than than a pillar. But
Oh, support. Yeah. Support is the other word, actually. I think pillar was extrapolated from, but support fully resonates as the even closer word. Sorry if I interrupted you there.
no, that's fine. Yeah. Well, I think the difference between the body and the soul. I mean, it's a bit abstract. Obviously, this whole conversation is a bit abstract, but I think wondering about what's the difference between the body and the soul. It's just, I think it's impossible to answer. Um, but there is karma, there is cause and effect, right? I mean, the things you do have effects, and the way things are now is because of the previous causes, your previous decisions. So I think it's at least more practical to observe the effects of the soul, the workings of the soul, both in your beliefs, your thoughts, your feelings, as well as your actions. The consequences of what you think and do. The things you think and do are affected by the soul-body complex. That's where behaviors are played out. That's where thoughts are had, is the body-soul complex. But it's an impossible
Right.
thing to split.
I see. And I think that's a really, again, a very grounded, very practical perspective for other people, other scientists even, who might be exploring in this research, something to take with them and investigate themselves. And so I know we're coming to the close of our 2 hours here, and I think that in sort of starting to wrap this up, I would love to ask you one final question, which is, do you have an absolutely favorite psychedelic experience? Not the experience itself, but like the psychedelic, like your favorite psychedelic.
You mean a specific substance or a specific experience?
Oh no, a specific substance. Like if you had a choice, you could do any psychedelic based on your experiences. What would be your favorite go-to?
Well, I'm just not that into psychedelics these days, but I like
Oh, okay.
ayahuasca. I like ayahuasca. I was a
Yeah.
member of a ayahuasca using church up in Santa Fe for a short while, and I really enjoyed those experiences. They were good, they were bad, they were hard, they were easy, but they were quite substantive. Yeah, I think ayahuasca has a lot of healing potential because of the combination of the two plants.
Yeah. That's been my experience too.
Well, speaking of that group, uh, in the interview earlier on, we were talking about intent as being as important as the actual substance. That church in Santa Fe that uses ayahuasca is called the UDV, and they were fighting legally to be able to use ayahuasca in their church ceremonies, and they had all of their ayahuasca confiscated by the DEA. It was held in storage. So for a number of years they did their ayahuasca ceremonies without ayahuasca. They just drank water, tap water. But they still worked. They still, did their work. So it was, the beliefs, the actions, the way of life, and, a group consciousness, but there was no ayahuasca. So I think, that's an interesting example of, the role of intent in determining what happens to you.
Yeah. Very much so. Very much so. Wow. Well, Rick, thank you again so much for coming on this podcast. This has been one of the most enlightening and engaging 2 hours of 2020 so far. I've been really, really amazed, and really grateful for everything that you bring. Really grateful for everything that you bring to the table in terms of, both, again, like the science and the spirit. You have both in a very grounded, down to earth, very practical awareness, and I think this is something we need more than ever right now. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Jordan. It was a great interview. I appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, with that, please have a beautiful rest of your day, and to everyone listening in, thank you so much for tuning in. And make sure, if you haven't read Rick's books, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, and DMT, The Soul of Prophecy, they are incredible. And do you have some more books too, right? You just said you finished one a year ago?
Yeah. I wrote an autobiographical novel a year ago. It's called Joseph Levy Escapes Death. And it's a story that's about my alter ego, who gets really sick and takes a long time to recover. So it's pretty dark, pretty mordant, but pretty funny. It's categorized under humor on Amazon, but it's pretty dark. And it gives insight into some of the workings of this alter ego. That was an interesting process. I was really sick. I almost died. I really got bad care, and I had to make the most of it. So I thought, if I survive, I'm going to write this up. More data, more grist for the mill. Yeah. So I recuperated, and I wrote it up, and it was published last year. It was just turned into an Audible book in May too. So, it is available.
I love audiobooks, so maybe I'll have to check that out too. And on that subject, are there any other websites or your work that you would recommend people to check out other than your books? Like, do you have a website or anywhere that you're kind of keeping people up to date with you and your work?
Yeah, I have a couple of pages on Facebook, a personal and a public page. I'm about full with my personal page with friends, but my public page is unlimited. So if I'm appearing on a show or finished a podcast, which is now up, if I've written something, I post things on both my Facebooks, and I have got my own website, rickstrassman.com. I respond to every email. Just about. I've gotten thousands of emails, maybe one or two I haven't responded to. But I generally do. You can order books through the website. I will sign and inscribe them.
Ooh, I might have to I might have to do that, because I would love a signed copy. I love your books. They're really they've really been impactful for me. So,
well, thanks. I always like hearing that.
I guess that's it. Rick, thank you again, and yeah, please have a beautiful day, and thanks everyone for tuning in.